Is this the, what I need? I can never move anything. All right, so I did find, so I'm going to go over, as you all know, I have a PowerPoint to use to lecture to all of you, but I did find what I think, this is an upload from something else. I'm sorry, I have a lot going on my computer right now. I did find this video on YouTube of a person who covers different therapies, and I just thought that her explanation of contextual family therapy was really well done. So I'm going to have us watch this to start, and then all of the concepts that I go into today will just be in further detail from what she
Hi guys, welcome back
covers.
to my channel.
Okay,
and if you're new, welcome to my channel. My name is Stephanie Yates, Anyabwile, Steph Anya for short, and I'm a licensed associate marriage and family therapist. This channel is for fellow therapists, those who are in the process of becoming therapists, and those who just want to use therapy insight to create their best life. In today's video, we'll be going over contextual family therapy. If you're curious about what that is, stay tuned.
Which I also think is very creative.
So first, as usual, I want to thank everyone who has been giving me suggestions for models. Contextual family therapy has come up a lot, so I'm just going to put a lot of those requests up on the screen. So thank you all so much for letting me know what you're wanting. For me, I could go any direction with these models, so it's really, really good to know the ones that you find to be the most useful. Please feel free to let me know what other models you'd like me to cover in the comments below, but make sure first to check out my playlist on models to make sure that it's not for a model that I've actually already done. I've done a few already, so always make sure you're staying up to date on that model playlist before you request another one. All right, so let's jump right into contextual family therapy. So I want to first say that there's a good chance I'm going to mispronounce the founder's name. Ivan Bosnomini Nagy, and I probably got that totally wrong, is a Hungarian psychiatrist. He's considered one of the founders of family therapy. He moved to the US in the 1950s. And like I always talk about when we talk about traditional or classic models in marriage and family therapy, 50s, early 60s, that's when we saw a lot of models emerging and the family therapy movement really being established. His contribution to marriage and family therapy is through the contextual family therapy model. What we're going to do today is go through the key concepts of contextual family therapy, how they view the problem. We're going to go through the interventions or techniques used in this model, and ultimately the goals of therapy with contextual therapy. Let's jump right in. The first thing to remember with contextual family therapy is that it is considered a multi-generational model or transgenerational model, meaning that there is an understanding that whatever characteristics or symptoms the family is experiencing was likely passed down through multiple generations. Whenever I do these reviews, I want to first let you all know the different words, buzzwords, concepts to look for if you're taking the exam especially, so that you can identify, oh, okay, this question is a contextual question, or this question is a structural family question. Another concept that is very unique to contextual family therapy is the idea of relational ethics. And what that really means is how fair and how just are we in our interpersonal relationships, particularly within the family. And that idea of having fairness and justice within a relationship is really the foundation for the contextual model. If you keep that in mind as we go through these sections, each section will make a lot more sense. What does
Oh no.
By the way, it's true.
Sorry.
You were victimized by that person, but you're now victimizing yourself. But
does being fair and just in a family look like? It's really being considerate of how decisions impact everyone as a whole. It's about not being completely focused on self, but also knowing that your family is considerate of you as well. So being fair and just and trustworthy within a family is the emphasis within this model. So let's move into a key concept with contextual family therapy, the 4 dimensions of relational realities. So the first dimension are the facts, things like a person's age, their gender, socioeconomic status, race. Those are the facts of any given family. The next layer is the individual psychology of each member of the family. So thinking about the inner workings, thoughts, emotions, feelings for any given member of the family. And keep in mind, when we talk about these original family therapy models, they were all typically targeted at working with the whole family or at least more than one member of the family. As we move into some of the later models, you're using systemic concepts, but they are easily applicable to individuals. These models can be applied to individuals as well, but they were really designed with the whole family in mind to create a bigger separation between traditional psychology and family therapy, which was still emerging. The next layer when you're working with the family is looking at the transactional patterns. And that is, how do each of these people interact with one another? So sister and brother might have a certain dynamic that greatly differs from sister and dad. So paying attention to the transactional patterns is another important thing for a therapist to focus on if they are utilizing contextual family therapy. And the last thing, what we talked about earlier, is paying attention to the relational ethics. So how fair are the family dynamics? Do you have a person, for example, who has sacrificed all of their passions, loves, pleasures in order to help the family or help an individual in the family? This is where a lot of attention is focused for contextual family therapy, is looking at those relational ethics. How much balance of give and take is there amongst this family? And the belief within this model is that all four of those things happen simultaneously. All of these contribute to the health of relationships. The facts, the individual psychology, the transactional patterns, and relational ethics are always simultaneously impacting the health of any given relationship. So now let's dive deeper into relational ethics. Bazarminianagi's approach to looking at relational ethics was based in what he referred to as a ledger. And I personally loved this metaphor or imagery of thinking of an actual ledger. That's what really made this model concrete for me when I was learning it in graduate school and focusing on it when I was studying for my exam. So this unconscious balance sheet, it's made up of credits and debits as you would with any ledger. But those credits and debits, instead of it being money, think of it as entitlements and obligations. This is how AATBS explained it, and it really helped me understand it better. This is where we see that the model is a transgenerational model, because when individuals experience fairness in their relationships growing up with their family, everyone considers everyone's opinions and needs, they're there for each other, they're reliable, they're dependable, then you carry that same expectation into your future relationships. But when we have experiences, for example, where maybe we were neglected by our parents as kids, we might expect our partners in our relationships when we get older to compensate for that neglect. And we put unbearable expectations on them to really love us in a way that we didn't feel loved before. And we don't have any experience with what that love is actually like. So our expectations of them are often unrealistic and really difficult to navigate. So this is how we see this being a transgenerational model, is because that ledger, if you feel that you were owed attention as a child, which you absolutely were, and you didn't get that attention, and the next generation, you might want your spouse or maybe even your kids to make that up for you. And so it happens the same way within the family. If you, for example, are a wife who has sacrificed your passions and your job for the family, and then you have children who might not seem as grateful to you as you would like them to be, you may take it out on the children or take it out on your spouse because you feel you're owed that resentment, you're owed that anger with everything you sacrificed. So when we talk about that ledger of entitlements and obligations, that's what we're talking about. How is everyone considered in the family? If not, how does that lack of justice impact the family dynamic? That is one of the most important things to pay attention to for a contextual therapist. The next important concept to think about is loyalties and legacies with contextual therapy. The idea of loyalties and legacies can be very powerful and bring families together, but it can also be very toxic and tear families apart. So a legacy, for example, we think of it as something that you learn and you pass down, right? Or you create and you pass down. So if you have the expectation, for example, maybe you had had siblings that bullied you growing up and nothing was said about it, then maybe you have the expectation that people suffer in silence or suffer alone. And you pass down that expectation that people are cruel or that people should not be defended, for example. So that's an example of a legacy where we can see how that could negatively impact a person's life and well-being. But maybe if you had parents who always stood up for you and affirmed you, then you have the expectation that that's a parent's job. And when you have your children, it's always important to you to listen to them and to affirm them. That's a positive legacy. Now let's talk about loyalties.
I'm so sorry,
sure
guys. I
you've
don't
heard
think
how
this happened
Grammarly
last time
improves
I
your writing,
watched it.
But let
Very
me
popular.
tell you how Grammarly Business
Loyalty, as we know, it represents our commitment to others, especially the people that we're close to. And loyalty is something that we definitely in popular culture think of as a positive thing. However, in contextual therapy, it's one thing you want to pay attention to, because if loyalty is unconscious and it influences our behaviors, sometimes it can actually get in the way of progress and growth. Let's say that you have an invisible loyalty to a parent who is, let's say, an alcoholic, for example. And the child has always learned that because you're loyal to your family, you don't tell people at school, you don't tell people about this problem at home. That could prevent that parent from ultimately maybe getting the help that they need or get the child out of a dangerous situation. So that's an example where an invisible loyalty can get in the way of us growing and making progress. Because what ends up happening is that we are reluctant to look for new options or explore other options because we're feeling loyalty to something that could be possibly hazardous to us, whether that be physically, emotionally, mentally, relationally. It could be hazardous, and we're not addressing it head on because of invisible loyalties. And that's just one example. But can you think of another example of invisible loyalties that could really get in the way that maybe you've even experienced in your own life? So the last concept we're going to talk about is entitlement. And entitlement is something that I think is relatively negatively connotated when we think about it in society, but it can be positive. You know, from birth, children are entitled to being taken care of, right? You can't speak up for yourself, you can't feed yourself. And so when those basic needs are met that we are entitled to, it can really help us be able to take on our responsibilities and obligations for others. Again, we see that transgenerationally, right? You might want to make sure you provide your child the same level of care that you received. That was great, right? However, we can see destructive entitlement when those things that we feel entitled to are not met. And when those things are not met, a lot of times we look to either return the favor to the people who wronged us, or even worse, to innocent people who weren't involved, like our kids or our partner or our grandkids. And so that destructive entitlement can really also get in the way of healthy relationships. And this sounds very similar to legacies and loyalties that we just talked about. The main difference with entitlement is that the person feels a certain justification in those problematic behaviors. Okay, you're abusive to your kid because your parents were abusive to you and I turned out fine, or I had to deal with it, they can deal with it. And we see that a lot. One of the most common ways I see that is when you have families that came through poverty, right? Maybe a couple of generations ago, the family could not survive on a single income. So maybe both parents had to work and then the kids had to work as well. And through moving up the social ladder, that family has actually been able to ascertain enough resources where that next generation, maybe they could have the option of going to college or focusing exclusively on their high school work and not having to work. But the parent feels like, okay, well, I worked when I was in school, so my kids should have to work too, right? It's almost a paying it off. There's a resentment, there's justification there, where the kid is basically feeling the impact of the parent's own resentment from what they had to experience when they were growing up. And they feel justified in making that decision because they feel like it may created the person I am today, but it might create unnecessary pressure and stress on your children, which prevents them from being able to excel even more because they didn't have to worry and have those same pressures and stressors that their parents did. That's an example that I see all the time where we can very clearly see that that destructive entitlement could actually hinder the family. Now, the very same choice could be an example of constructive entitlement if you truly feel that working, being out in the world helped you develop as a person and you feel that your child deserves that same opportunity to build. It's all about intention and outcome, right? So the very exact same situation could be constructive entitlement. But that's an example where more often than not, I see it becoming destructive entitlement because the parents are actually responding from anger from what they've had to deal with at their child's age and feeling that their child has it too easy. The way that the problem or maladaptive behavior is viewed in contextual family therapy is pretty simple. It's about fairness. So if we're seeing a lack of justice, fairness, trust within a family, then that's going to lead to dysfunctional patterns and behaviors. So that's the view of the problem. So therapy goals, really it boils down to accountability. Saying, okay, it looks like your child, the first maybe 5-10 years of their life, you weren't very involved. Can you accept that that impacted them? And what would you be willing to do to help make up for some of that lost time? For example, that is something that you could look at. So the goal with contextual therapy is rebalancing that ledger by encouraging family members to take accountability for the areas where maybe they've taken a bit more than they've given. Now let's talk about the process. Let's talk about techniques and interventions. So the first thing to think about is that whenever a therapist is practicing contextual family therapy, you always want to consider at least 3 generations worth of family members. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have all 3 generations in the room, but if you have a parent and child, for example, you should definitely be asking the parent questions about their relationship with their parents growing up, and even further back if you can, because it gives a lot of insight into the dysfunction that is manifesting today. Contextual therapy is not branded as a brief model. It could take weeks, it could take years. Really, the family makes the decision about when they feel comfortable ending therapy. And that's going to be a decision, hopefully based on them feeling that they're able to consistently expect and receive fairness, justice, trust within the family consistently. And so once they feel that they're at a point where they all can be held accountable, they know what they can do to help each family member feel okay, and they say, okay, we don't really feel like we need services anymore, that is when therapy comes to a close. So you want to focus therapy on helping assess each family member's needs. What do they need more of? What do they need less of? And seeing who is willing to be responsible for that? Who do they need to be responsible for that? Contextual therapy is not about exaggerating problems. It's about helping to find where are the gaps and how can we fill those gaps in. The therapist should practice multi-directed partiality. And what that means is that the therapist takes the perspective of each client in the room. So opposed to some of the other traditional models we've talked about, like structural family therapy or strategic family therapy or even Bowenian, where a lot of times they're going to encourage you to either side with the parents. You want to help the parents establish some authority at the top of the hierarchy, or in Bowenian's case, where he suggests you work with the most differentiated family member. What Bazur-Mini Nagy is recommending is that you try to understand each family member's perspective. Maybe sometimes you speak on their behalf and ask, is that what you were saying? Give the family an opportunity to respond and do the same with another family member. So you want to feel like each family member's ally, which can be hard to accomplish, but is really important for accurately being able to assess each family member's needs. How can you do that? One of the main techniques or concepts in this model is to practice empathy. You want to be able to understand each family member's pain. And the most important thing to remember when you're doing that, just knowing from my work with clients, is that sometimes we can become so empathetic towards one family member that we lose empathy for another. But recognizing that both people are hurting hurting in some way and trying to figure out how they can work together to help alleviate some of that hurt is very critical. So practicing empathy with each family member, trying to see where you connect and understand their perspective is really critical with this model.
Sorry, another one's coming.
Hopefully tonight, as the terrorist rebellion enters another year,
Their technique is crediting. And this is where the therapist pretty much validates each family member's experience. So a lot of times what will happen when you have a family member who complains about some experience in the family or they're hurt about something, in order to deal or alleviate guilt, family members will reject that experience for them. They'll say, that's not how it happened. You're over exaggerating. Did that really make you feel like that? Oh, you're just showing out for the therapist. These are all things that I have heard, right? Instead of joining in and asking like, so do you not think that's true? The therapist's first job is to credit them and say, wow, it really sounds like what you needed was this, and that wasn't provided to you. And it might make other family members upset, but their turn will come where they get the same technique or treatment. So making sure that you validate each person's experience of unfairness is really important. The next technique is acknowledgement of effort. This model is credited as being a really positive model where the therapist is really trying to focus on creating a positive culture within the family. Because typically if you've got that unbalanced ledger, there's going to be a lot of blaming, a lot of criticizing, a lot of resentment. And the therapist is really working overtime to help make those family members feel more positive. And so acknowledging the effort of individual family members, what they've already been doing in the relationship. Maybe you say to a parent who's had a drug addiction, I really commend you on not allowing substances to get in the way of your connection with your family. Now we just need to work on making up for lost time. So helping each family member recognize what they've already done so they feel motivated in that work, and also helping the other family members see that each person is trying their best. Now, let's see if we can raise the bar for what their best looks like. And lastly, as we've already talked about, accountability. You want to make sure that each family member is aware of their role in another family member's hurt or pain. Acknowledging, accepting, and having them validate another person's experience is a great way to help bring some understanding and more balance to the family ledger. Some other techniques, one that I really love is exoneration. And that is really understanding, especially for a previous generation. I talked about exoneration in a video I did on toxic family members, talking about my own personal experience with exoneration. And that really is about thinking about those previous generations in context, thinking about what your parents or grandparents went through and their experiences that led to how you were treated. So understanding the intergenerational patterns that have contributed to another family member's harmful or toxic behavior can be freeing both for the person who behave that way and the person who experienced the behavior. And the last technique I'll talk about is lending weight. And this is where you might have a family member who's having a hard time articulating their experience. And the therapist then kind of weighs in and will try to communicate for the child and ask them if they are getting it right. You could simplify what they're saying with yes or no questions. You might use circular questioning, other techniques to help the child or whomever is having a difficult time articulating their feelings. You help them be able to get their point across and make sure that everyone else in the room understands what they're saying as well. So that is the end of our contextual family therapy review. I hope that you found that useful. A lot of you have been asking for this review.
All right. Where am I? Where are you? Where is everybody? I can't see any of you. Oh, stop share, Sarah. Come on. I continue to struggle with Zoom. Yeah, so I'm so glad to see advertisements throughout her video because I hope that means that she's getting paid because she's doing great work and putting a really good information out there. So yeah, Justine, before I get into my PowerPoint that just kind of complements everything that she's talked about so far.
I didn't like the video. but I have reasons because I love contextual therapy, and I found it really one-dimensional because I think from the beginning she talks or highlights transactional relationships when his theory was actually opposed to that, in terms of him criticizing family therapy for depersonalizing it, the individual, and how important it was to integrate. And I think even in terms of loyalty and context, there wasn't a framework where I think this theory specifically is very clear on its philosophical underpinnings, which when you only look at the interventions or those concepts in that dimension doesn't go in depth as to what it really means, if that makes sense.
Okay. So Justine, I so invite you to comment on the PowerPoint as I'm doing it as well. No,
I'm
this
like, I don't feel.
well, because I'll be very frank with all of you. I am a human being and I have the approaches that I feel like I have a pretty good handle on. Contextual is not one of them. So I am basically a week ahead of you in learning this. I've had some exposure to it. So I wouldn't experience that as all as being like undermining or anything like that. If you have a more nuanced understanding of what I am presenting, I am so open to you having some commentary. I know that you're presenting on this next week, but I also, I just really want, y'all are steps away from being my colleague. So I really want to invite that if it's something you feel comfortable with, no pressure.
Yeah, and I think I also had a few questions about the foundations in the reading. I don't know if I should ask you now or later. That it just helped me. I think it would help to underlie the theory because he mentions a lot about Buber and Fairstein, is it? And I didn't completely understand. I understand it's the foundation in terms of the dialectic, but in terms of the interconnectedness, I didn't really understand that part.
So with are you talking about the I thou?
No, wait, I put it in my notes. Buber's existential view of dialogue and Fairburn served as an entity foundation for contextual therapy. So I'm just wondering how do those two serve as a foundation?
Anyone? So I do know that, so some people say Naj, some people say Naji. I haven't ever heard him pronounce his name. So I know that there's influence by object relations. Oh, okay, sorry, I was getting some feedback. Where's my PowerPoint? That's not it. Nope. Object relations, as well as existential and relational philosophy, which I am much less. The only part that I really understand about that is the I thou positioning of the therapist and encouraging that in the clients. So that's basically meaning, meeting another whole person with your whole person.
I would piggyback a little bit on that. To my understanding, the dialogue and that Buber's theory kind of stands on is not understanding God as this abstract being, but rather getting into a relationship with whatever that you are trying to find out or figure out, and that we can find through meeting one another, but at an I thou level, which is at your realest self, you meet another real self, and that is the dialogue.
Yeah, so maybe Justine, that's something that you, Jackie, Seda, and Denise
Yes, I will get on.
Can talk a little more about next week. Yeah, he's also, go ahead, Marcy.
Yeah, I was just digging out something from some old Imago therapy worksheet that I managed to save. And so coming back to the I thou, that's the hyphen is the important part, because it's that each member of the dyad in this case has a sense that the relationship exists as a third entity. So just to have
Okay, great.
thrown that in.
Yeah, which I think is very true to a relational approach to therapy. Any other comments or questions? All right. So we'll have, like I said, hopefully a little bit more time for application here. I'm using the case study that I provided all of you. All right, so here is Dr. Naji. So as stated, just some contextual stuff, no pun intended, he immigrated from the Hungary into the United States. One of the founders of an approach that was trained in a field at least akin to psychology, but you can see in this approach some of the psychoanalytic foundations or teachings that Naj was exposed to, and then his history, well, trained as a psychiatrist. So true to the times as well. There was a initial focus of his on families where a member has schizophrenia, and then it was very popular for a time. And then Naj branched off and started focusing more on transgenerational issues within the family. You can see, like, for example, with Bowen, where the conceptualization of schizophrenia was intergenerationally or transgenerationally informed. Okay, so as mentioned, and Justine very excited to learn a little bit more about some of the philosophical underpinnings. So influenced by object relations, where you can see some of that intergenerational influence, as well as the concept of entitlement and how that may be informed by object relations. Philosophical, that I'm limited in my understanding of that. And then Sullivan's interpersonal psychiatry. So as mentioned, there are 4 dimensions of assessment in contextual where they intersect to inform a more holistic, comprehensive assessment of the individuals within the system as well as the system. So this is just like a graphic of that, and I'll go more in detail about what each of these are. So these are objective facts. So you'll be looking at things like gender, religion, ethnicity, race, these aspects of an individual that are more concrete, the more given, history of physical health as well as current physical health. So really trying to understand what is present in influencing each individual, not only how they view themselves, but how they interact with their family, as well as view other family members. Their personal history, what was their family of origin like, birth order, that kind of stuff that would influence an individual, as well as events in a life cycle. So we know of stressors as horizontal and vertical. These both play a role in the assessing of these objectifiable facts, where, was there a experience of an untimely death of a family member? How has the legacy of that individual been carried? How does that affect the family member's ability to relate to one another? But that's the integration of these pieces. But you're looking at the events in the life cycle as a fact of a person's history as well. So then you're also looking at the person's individual psychology. So this intrapsychic process, again, you can see where that psychoanalytic foundation or some of that influence lies here. So you're looking and seeing, what does each individual in the system, what do they believe? What are their ideas? So this is where that multi-directional partiality and the crediting and the empathy plays a real role in the assessment here, because you're essentially giving each person a platform. So you are being very explicit and very purposeful in how you are interacting with each member of the family and how you are allowing their thoughts, their feelings to be spoken. So any sort of memories and experiences, this is something where, again, the multi-directed partiality and the empathy and crediting, these types of things are really important to integrate into a discussion around memories where, you know, the individual may have, so each of this is constructed, right? So we each have our own perspective on a memory that very much may differ from those of our family members. So you are giving each person the opportunity to share their perspective on a memory while providing them validation and understanding and modeling that for the family, where they may have historically been met with a dismissal or a denying of what had happened. So Justine says, I think the importance of the influence of object relation lies in how contextual therapy frames loyalty, just as in object relations, which is rooted in the implicit dialogue between self and the other. Loyalty can show itself as unconsciously blaming a current relationship to the relationship with the family system. So we'll, yeah, thank you for that, Justine. And then, of course, motivations for behavior, understanding intentions, what's going on, and then also allowing for that personality to be expressed and modeling acceptance of that. That's something that is highlighted in this approach as well. So those transactional patterns, this is where we're getting more into the systemic relational piece of this approach. So you're assessing the structure of the family by observing the processes, alliances, and power. These are all pieces that are integrated, and you can see how, as we're going through class, each of the approaches there's quite a bit of overlap and some evolution that's happening as we're moving through all of these. And just as Justine, this is perfect for what you typed in here of the idea of loyalty, or the concept that's embedded in contextual of loyalty. And I'll talk about split loyalty later. And the invisible loyalty is more on an unconscious level, or it's something that's just not as explicit, and it may be something that is either destructive or constructive. Then the last piece of the assessment is looking at relational ethics. So this is looking at seeing if the giving and receiving in relationships is equal, or like what is the distribution. So as Justine noted, it's not as simple as just transactions. It's more on a level of ethics and a level of feeling seen, heard, understood, having space provided, effort into the relationship. And so when you are assessing on this level, you are also looking, as was mentioned, previous to this current family. So you're looking transgenerationally, you're looking at the potential influence of members' feelings of indebtedness to other family members and their entitlements that can be both constructive and destructive. You're also looking to see if there's been a history of violation of love and trustworthiness. You know, have they had a space? Have they been sent messages that they are valued? Have they been sent messages that they are lovable, that they are unlovable? And then fairness within the relationship, and we'll get more into that in regard to the ledger. Justine, do you want to go ahead and share this, like speak it? Oops.
I didn't want to like stop your presentation because yours is so good, but I just wanted, is it okay if I?
Yes, seriously, Justine, please hop in. Like, I really want to honor the knowledge that each of you bring. And if this is something that you have like studied and feel very comfortable with, I am so happy like sharing the platform.
I wouldn't say I'm like very comfortable teaching anything, but I really like the theories and I've read a lot about it, and I could be wrong. I'm just, this is how I've interpreted it. So I think I'm just going to read what I said and then elaborate. So I just said a way to look at the individual and the transactional patterns within the system also requires contextual therapy to be looked at as an integrative approach due to the split in previous psychotherapy forms that either look at the individual or the system. Transactional patterns are said to have depersonalized the individual experience. The transactional patterns was not complete without regard for understanding the individual to understand the pattern. It's more about the relational motivation rather than the transactional pattern. So I think what I'm saying by that, if we look at the reading that we did, I think Naji takes a very integrative stance because of the lack of integration between, say, clinical psych and MFTs. So his theory was a way of marrying them. And in order for him to do that, he commented on how clinical psych doesn't focus enough on systems, but the thing that could happen with systems is that we concentrate too much on the system without acknowledging the individuality within us. So when he kind of criticizes or critiques transactional patterns in other theories like Bowen or structural, because it becomes a system problem. And which is why I think it also relates to the 4 stages and how, I mean, not the 4 stages, but the 4 interconnecting domains, and how he really emphasizes on the individual working with the system. But instead of using transactional patterns, I think going back to what Dr. Lappin said, the ethics behind it and the motivation of each member is very important.
Yes, thank you so much. And that's where the concept of accountability, to me, is a bit of a differentiating factor between contextual and some of the other approaches that we have looked at so far in class. Great, thank you, Justine. Yes, feel free to hop in. This is great. All right, so the ledger. So hopefully this will be a little bit nuanced here. So yes, as Justine said, it is more than the behavioral transactions. We're looking at the motivation behind the interactions and the personal accountability of the individuals interacting with one another. So again, the ledger is really about the give and take and recognizing that some relationships are inherently asymmetrical and some relationships are symmetrical. And I think I'm going to get to that in the next slide. So with the idea of the ledger and the give and take and the ebb and flow and the togetherness, as well as the separateness in systems, is that there's the idea that each individual is obligated to participate, to contribute, to give. And in that, in terms of fairness and equity, that they're entitled constructively to receive. And then we'll talk a little bit about how that can become destructive. So the idea is when the ledger and when accountability and contribution is equal, based on the role, because again, asymmetrical, symmetrical, when it's in balance, there's a sense of fairness that each individual within the system feels a sense of satisfaction with that. So the hope is that, so one of the goals of contextual is personal accountability, also recognizing what your needs are while also recognizing your contribution to the system. So the hope, and one of the pieces that is a goal of contextual, is to have this experience of fairness be consistent and persistent. So the idea that give and take is equitable to your role in your developmental stage and all that kind of stuff, this builds a sense of trustworthiness within the relationship. Go ahead. Go ahead, Justine.
Oh, I just wanted to elaborate on what you were talking about asymmetry, because I think it's important to note that Naji really emphasized this idea of multilateral relationships and the asymmetry. And he had critiqued previous family therapies by saying like, oh, when you look at schizophrenia or you look at this, you look at how the parent is acting like, how do I say this? The parent is contributing to the problem, but also understanding the child. But within his theory, it also talks a lot about how, like, for example, when a child is born, that child is going to grow up within the ethics that have already previously been there by the parents. And therefore, although he doesn't like to use the word power, he talks about the struggle of that and how basically going back to the multi-generational aspect of it, of not having experience rejunction within the intergenerational system.
Yeah, and I'll talk about the concept of rejunction later in the PowerPoint. Thank you, Justine. So might he disagree with the belief that a symptomatic client is a reflection of the symptom of the system? I don't think so. I think there would be the idea that this individual is informed by the system, but there's also the duality of the individual as a piece of the system. So I don't think that would be something that would be rejected as a symptomatic client not being a reflection. Yeah, that's, thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, the individual is emphasized more so than in some of and that personal accountability is emphasized more so, but this is still an inherently systemic approach. So I don't think you can separate the individual from the system, and the individual being informed by the system and the dynamics that exist within the system.
Yeah, I think to go off what you're saying too, in the text, there's a good example of when he talks about schizophrenia and how he says most therapeutic modalities haven't been able to help anyone with psychosis or anything like that, because they don't take into consideration the foundation of how much not only the current systems can affect one another, but the previous systems affecting that person. And so I think through his theory, he tries to take both of them into account, like you said, Jocelyn, in order to help heal that type of diagnosis. Because in his eyes, that has never happened before. Does that make sense? I'll try to find the page though, because I think, hold on.
I'll go ahead and stop the share here. So.
Oh, okay, here I have it. It says, it's on page 29. And he says, anyone involved in the demanding attempts to help psychotics was put to an early test. Bateson et al. Came to important conclusions about how double binding communications contribute to the onset and development of schizophrenia. Significantly, however, most family therapists eventually abandoned their work with schizophrenics. The tedious process of helping people learn how to trust again seemed to become too trying. So I think it all goes back to this idea of trust and how trustworthiness had never been explored within family therapy, especially in terms of the schizophrenic, when the double bind trust is lost because of the opposing messages. Therefore, his way to relate the individual to the system is by regaining trust.
Does that help, Jocelyn? Thank you, Justine.
Yeah, I think I just wanted a bit of that. It helped what you guys were saying with clarifying a little bit of what he was trying to stand for
Mhm.
in his approach, and I appreciate that he's also saying, hey, let's not de-emphasize the individual within the system. Let's also recognize that there are some things within the individual too that we need to really remember to put in consideration.
Yeah, to me, the differentiating factor is the heightened emphasis on the individual, whereas many of the approaches that we've discussed so far is kind of like, well, this person makes sense in context, and let's really focus on the context, and let's not focus, which is, I guess, a little bit maybe counterintuitive for what we're talking about, like focusing on just the context while not really having that individual accountability for like decisions, behaviors, and some of that, the personality contribution to that individual.
It was kind of like returning to the blend of both.
Yes, which I think is one of the reasons why this is appealing to some and like very confusing to others. Yeah, Caitlin.
Question?
Sure.
Just off, I guess, the conversation I'm thinking, and then Justine talked about a child being born into the family, and I'm wondering, so like, would that destine that child to be in an asymmetric like relationship with the parents, or like that's naturally just how it's going to be because they've already come into this like family of relational ethics?
Yeah, so according to this approach, a parent-child relationship is inherently asymmetrical because the give and take is equitable to the development and the ability to contribute, but it's not equal. So
Right.
That's what's different. So symmetrical is you have resources, you're developmentally and life cycle in the same place so you can contribute in an equal way. And with a parent and child, the child has entitlements from the parent that the parent doesn't have from the kid. So that's where it is inherently asymmetrical. And
And it will always be, correct? Like always, because I mean, I feel like, I think that might be where like you get families that are having difficulty almost, is where like you have an adult child who's like, I'm my own person. Like we're going to have a different kind of relationship now. I've launched, et cetera, et cetera. But like the parent almost expects it to continuously be that asymmetric relationship.
Yeah, that's a great question. Justine, do you have something for it? I also think it's very culturally informed too.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can eliminate that aspect of it and the nuance of that. So were you going to speak to that, Justine? Not maybe the culture.
Oh yeah. I was gonna I think in a way, this is where the influence of object relations really comes into contextual therapy, because it talks about the self and the object. And I think there was a really good example in the text, and I think I texted to you, Caitlin, where it was like, why aren't you acting like I've let you closer to me than the object, which is my father? Why aren't you treating me better? And so that transference already is affecting the relationship with the child once it's born because of all the things that have happened to the parents.
So do you think that in a contextual lens, that the child can ever come out of that asymmetric relationship, like based on their definition of their self?
I don't think it can come out of that asymmetric relationship. I do think exoneration and rejunction can happen, but the power imbalance never goes away. But he also doesn't, that's why he doesn't use the word power, more so asymmetrical, because it's not about power, but basically just showing, I think you can equate the relational ethics to the history that has happened with parents before the child is born, and that can never go away. But you can work on the rejection and exoneration of how that has transferred to you.
So forever asymmetrical,
Forever.
regardless of resources, age, capacity, things like that.
I almost feel like a family would do really well with like having contextual from like the early childhood development to like be able to understand potentially what they're going to be passing on to their children in terms of their ledger. Because I imagine like after you've let a kid grow up for 18 years and then you maybe go into that, it's going to be
Right.
it's going to be hard to forgive and to exonerate and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah. Great question, Caitlin. Marcy. Thank you, Justine, too.
Yeah, so well, a couple of things are occurring to me as part of this discussion. One is, not just the parent-child relationship, but all relationships I would imagine have some sort of asymmetry to them, especially at different times and in different contexts, different ages, different situations, that there would always be that striving, I would hope, striving toward something resembling symmetry, but it never is quite that. Especially in terms of the parent-child relationship. And like Caitlin was saying, as children get older and they become adults and they launch, it gets a little bit more in the equivalency range that becomes more equilateral. And then we shift over into something approaching what it looked like early on when the parents become aged and the child becomes then the caretaker for the parent, and how that would then, how you would have to, as a therapist, look at these different life stages, relationships in terms of how the individuals in them are then struggling with rebalancing or struggling with trying to hold on to that original sense of who they were in the context of the relationship, given how circumstances have changed.
I think the only thing that I will, I think according to this approach, that their symmetrical relationships do exist, because it's about the consideration that's given to one another that is equal. It's not necessarily about resources and I think I'm understanding what you're talking about in terms of things like, for example, gender dynamics, or, these pieces of somebody's social position that may inherently be unequal or asymmetrical. But in terms of the contribution, effort, consideration that is being given to another person, that there do exist symmetrical relationships. Yi, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I had a kind of similar idea, because if we take that into the Asian culture, like we talk about, just Marcy just mentioned, the parents take care of the children when they're young, and when the parents grew older, we pay back that ledger and kind of taking care of them when they're older. So I'm thinking about when we see this is asymmetrical relation, does that mean in certain types of time, or in how that counts in the long term? Would we consider that to be symmetrical, or in different periods it's different?
I actually think you bring up a really good example, because even though the action may seem like it's asymmetrical in terms of the younger generation, basically taking care of the older generation, it's still asymmetrical because they feel that obligation to do it. So the asymmetry is in the obligation to take care of the older generation, even though it may look like the roles have changed. Does that make sense? Why do you feel obligated to do that?
Mm-hmm.
May I jump in on that?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the pathology lies, is the merit aspect. So the human order is the parent takes care of the child, and then the child's in between who's taking care of the offspring. The pathology lies in when the parent places the obligation on the child to pay back versus kind of unilaterally just putting it out there. And the merit would be if the child wants to come back and repay out of their own will because they trust the relationship is so good that they want to give the parent that justice. But if the parent starts to kind of
Expect.
collude,
Yeah.
collude and like put expectations on the child, thank you, and wants exactly, and like triangulating, and I know this is a Bowen term, but whatnot. That's when the injustice starts to take place, and that's when the pathology starts to form, and that's where the child usually is the one that's, you know, getting the blame.
Love this. Thank you so much, Seda. This is great. I love the discussion. Yes, Caitlin.
I know, I love this so much. Going off what Seda says, and I'm wondering too, like maybe that's potentially why we see maybe some more issues around this in the Western society, because I'm wondering like like a traditionally like Asian culture where that is like, that there's no one has a problem with that. That is just how it goes. And that asymmetry, like I totally get what Justine was saying, that totally made sense. And I'm wondering, like, I look at our society and the way that we treat our elders, and I wonder about like how that culture changes, or how that gets acculturated on other families, or that pressure, and when that changes, and how we kind of we do lack a technical care of our elder population. Like we'll just, you know, put them in homes, and we don't want to see them. And so I wonder too, like how that impacts those family dynamics over time. Like I'm thinking just like culturally, and I'm also thinking like Western versus like other societies,
Yeah.
and how that comes into play.
I think, oh, go ahead.
No, you're good, Justine. Go ahead.
Oh, I think one thing I do really like about this theory is even though it doesn't specify culture, it does specify on your self-determined values and ethics within a family. So my family's relational ethics may look different to yours. And depending on what the ledger looks like within the family, that would determine the culture. So like, for example, if you were to home your mom because that's something she wanted, it would look different because the values, the motivation and ethics behind why you're doing something would look different to someone who's a family who's doing it to spite their parents, if that makes sense.
Yes. I'm just wondering, like, when does that family ledger change, and how does it change? Because I can see where this has happened, where like normally maybe you grow up and then you have a complete falling out with your family and you no longer want to do any of that. And is that like the ultimate, obviously, break of trust in that family?
Are you speaking in relation to taking care later on in life?
Yeah.
So potentially still feeling an obligation to that, or denying the
completely denying it. Like at one point just being like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And like a complete emotional cutoff or something like that. Like how do we take that into account with contextual when a family's completely almost like separated themselves?
Yeah.
I think it goes back to building trust. So in order for something having to happen, kind of like Bowen, in terms of like, even if emotional cutoff is a form of low differentiation, so would it be in this theory. But I think this theory emphasizes through the 4 domains that in order for rejunction or exoneration to happen, you're going to have to get the whole family or find ways to forgive your family in order to change your attitude towards your family. If not, the way you feel about that will be transmitted to the next generation, because the theory talks a lot about, I didn't even know what that meant, posterity and later generations. So I think the cost of that emotional cutoff and not building trust is the price of it affecting the generations after you, not even only on a like familial system, but in a general system. Because I also think, like I did one of my conference presentations on third order change within this theory, but it's also about this whole idea of like society affecting family and vice versa.
And I'm curious too, in your example, Caitlin, if you may not work with, so let's say you're talking about I'm going to put myself to hopefully make this make sense. I'm cut off from my parents. I'm tired of them. I feel no obligation to care for them. I don't want anything to do with them. So I'm wondering if you may not see me and my parents in therapy, that you may see my children in their relation to me in therapy, if that makes sense. So there would be some like ripple, like transgenerational ripple effects of that. Because I'm also like curious in your example, like you'd also have to have a family come to you that wants to mend, that may be motivated to heal some of those things. So I'm also curious, I would be curious about like the distress that it's creating in the family. So I might be going rogue on you.
No, I think I'm interested to see like maybe how society's impacted like families. And I'm thinking about somebody who, and Justine Lynn kind of helped me realize it's going to be more of the generation. So like, say my family is super tight, we have a major falling out, maybe a whole bunch of stuff has happened and I'm completely cut off. I then have my own children. And so maybe one of those like rules that we have is like, you take care of your elders, but because I didn't take care of my parents, I'm not really instilling that in my children, therefore then they might. So like, that's kind of how that maybe some of those changes that we've seen and some it can ripple down.
Yeah. Which would be considered a legacy in this approach.
Right. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Ploy. Actually, okay. We'll keep rocking. Go ahead, Ploy.
I'll wrap it up really quick.
No, you're good. You're good. Take your time. Take your time. I'm sorry. I should not have said that. Ploy, say your thing, whatever you want.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, like, outside of including everyone in session, because with the examples that you just give right now, from my understanding, which I could be wrong, is that even like just from the framework itself, even though you're not able, let's say there's like a lot of cutoffs, it's impossible to mend, just the understanding of like the foundation of ledger and trust is going to be will serve as a roadmap to understand the problem that emerged through that asymmetrical relationships. And then from there, I believe that like contextual can also be useful just on an individual levels. And I feel like I love contextual and I relate so much because of like, and I feel like with collectivistic cultures, contextual is kind of like a blueprint of how things work. Like I feel indebted of like my parents. I feel like I owe people everything. So having that said, like let's assume that I do not speak to my family at all. Those things will still be transmitted intergenerationally through what I have internalized from the betrayal, from in my invisible loyalties, from the trust that has been broken. And then, yeah, I don't know the last sentence that I was gonna, it just left my head, but my whole point is that I feel like it works both, even though it's a theory that focused so much on the whole relational context and the whole family system, it can be utilized just for like individual level.
Yeah, I think that's the intellectual piece of this too, is that can really help to inform some insight at like, so putting the person into context based on or informed by the generations that came before them. Yeah, thank you so much, Ploy. All right, let's go ahead. Juliana, I saw that you had a hand up. Let's go ahead and take a break because I want to give you guys a chance to decompress for a second. So let's come back together at 3:27. Resume. So some examples of this, or some consequences of destructive entitlement, and we'll talk more in depth about this. I have several slides about it. It can be a lack of remorse in your relational or family behavior. So again, I am justified in what I have done. This happened to me. This is a lesson that I learned. This is a message that I have internalized. Therefore, I'm going to pass this along, or I'm going to do this without guilt, without remorse. So another consequence is people who have experienced destructive entitlement from their parents refuse to blame them. So isn't necessarily onus that is given to the individual. So they're going to continue to earn that destructive entitlement through remaining loyal. We'll talk about invisible loyalties and stuff like that, I think, in the next slide, and being essentially like kind of captives to the past. Yes, Justine.
Yeah, I think one thing that really helped me, because I know even though he critiqued Bowen, he was somewhat informed by Bowen too. And a good metaphor that helped me is kind of understanding it in terms of how differentiation can look different from being very reactive to emotionally cut off. So when you look at destructive entitlement, that can also look the same way as Dr. Lappin just mentioned, in terms of, oh, like I feel justified to react to my parents, but also in terms of not blaming them at all either. So the way that can present can also look differently.
Absolutely. Thank you. So speaking of loyalty, so ultimately the goal is to understand your loyalties, to have them be visible, voluntary, explicit. So the concept of loyalty, it's an ethical concept of obligation. We've talked about this in many of the examples of like caregiving to parents later in life. And in terms of the ledger, loyalties usually transcend any sort of imbalance. So it can still be a, non-reciprocal or imbalanced relationship, but because of the loyalty, it's not seen as such. It's not conceptualized as imbalanced. So with loyalty, it absolutely can be invisible. So these are, again, loyalty and legacy are very intertwined in this approach, where the loyalties govern our relationships with not only ourselves, but others, and they're passed down through generations. So, and it's not conscious, it's not necessarily by choice. And sometimes these loyalties can be quite destructive in not allowing for constructive entitlements to occur. Justine.
Yeah, I think one definition that I really liked in the book, because it also incorporates two more concepts from this theory, is that loyalty is a sense of preferential commitment to a relationship based on indebtedness born of earned merit. So this idea of indebtedness and merit also coincides with the concepts of destructive and constructive entitlement.
Yes. And then there's also the concept of split loyalty. So this is when a person is forced to be loyal to one person and consequently disloyal to another. This can happen with children of divorced parents, where if you are, engaging with or choosing one partner, then you are actively being disloyal or not choosing the other. So in a way, it's a bit of a double bind. Then we've alluded to this in some of our discussion, also the concept of parentification. So this is, in that inherently asymmetrical relationship. So it's a misuse of the higher position or the parental position. And it's essentially a role reversal, where if it's asymmetrical parent-child, then you're putting the child in a position of responsibility or that is inappropriate, not only developmentally, but in terms of responsibility within the family. So some examples of this, the second one is actually one that I haven't really thought about, could be an example of parentification. So if anyone has any thoughts on this. So again, as Justine has been talking about in terms of a sense of obligation, or a lack of choice in this, of children who are forced to take care of their parents in some way. And that can be through having an illness, an ailment, so that the parent has some sense of purpose. So they're getting a need vicariously met by keeping a child, a person who may be grown and developmentally not a child, keeping them infantilized so that the parent has a sense of identity. So it's essentially using the child for the benefit or for the needs of a parent, which is inappropriate. Any thoughts on the second? it's just, it was novel to me. I don't know if maybe this is a notion that other people have heard of.
I think of Sex in the City. Which one of the four friends was the one that was married to the doctor whose mom kept popping up every time they were trying to be intimate or anything of such sort?
Charlotte.
Mm-hmm. I think that relationship would definitely exemplify this. At least
Yeah.
husband.
Yeah, because who is she without being a mom? Okay. Then there's the concept of the revolving slate. So again, very heavily multi-generationally informed. But this is the transmission of injustice and destructive entitlement that's essentially without intervention, without interruption, continue to be passed to, so you're just going to see it over and over again in subsequent generations. So when, for example, parents have some unresolved issues in their family of origin, they seek their entitlement from their children. So in doing this, they don't allow their children to have their own constructive entitlement. And then it creates a dynamic of repeating the injustices that were bestowed. I don't know what that's the verb that just came to me just now, upon the person, and then they're passing it to the next generation with some of these asymmetrical relationships. You want to elaborate on that, Carolyn?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how usually in the family dynamic, sometimes we see as a parentified children as negative, but especially when it comes to like immigrant families, Latinx or Asian, and when it comes to language broker, which means translating absolutely everything, being taken out of school or a doctor's appointment because mom or dad had an appointment, or making calls when you're doing homework. So taking away the time in order to serve this sort of like dynamic of survival mechanism in order to better acculturate and assimilate. And like, there's a lot of positives that come out of that too.
Yeah.
Purpose to like teach parents and adolescents enough about the dominant culture to access resources and achieve like this sort of success or pathway to success. And I think there's, one of my studies that I did was on specifically Latina children, undocumented Latino children, and the long-term positive impacts of like their vocabulary, their sense of self, their organization and development, in order to be able to balance everything that they do from the age of like 4 or 5 years old all the way to their like high school. I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not always negative to see a child that is parentified. It could be just a survival mechanism through the barriers they face.
Would you consider that dynamic a parentification of a child?
I wouldn't define it as parentified. I mean, you're taking the role as a parent sometimes, because the role of the parent is to call, to answer for the bills or pay the bills, or make sure the daughter is being looked over appropriately by the doctor when they're also doing that, and vice versa. The interaction is still happening.
Yeah.
But the language, though, it could be problematic.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. Does anyone, I love that. I think that that's a really important, like dynamic within a family to understand and see. Does anyone else have any thoughts on its connection to parentification? Like, is that
I'm curious though, because I didn't actually see the concept of parentification within the text at all.
Yeah, I
was also curious to see where, because I understand where it would be, but I think like Erlen said, the idea of parentification can have a negative connotation. And I didn't see that within the text and so I was just wondering if it was, because I think if it were, then it could be somewhat problematic. But that's why I'm trying to look for it right now.
I did some supplemental readings outside of the text.
Oh, okay.
I did not get that in the text.
There actually is a conversation about that. It's past like page 150. I need to find it, but there's an example that was given where the mom was, I think, a deaf. She had a physical disability, and dad put a lot of, sorry, that put a lot of bind on the child. And so contextual therapists, what they did to practice multi-directional partiality had taken note of that and had requested somebody to make sure to be there to translate for the mom so that they would take the burden off the child of having to do that work.
I've had one case where the child was very much parentified and it was very negative. This behavior allowed mom to behave as a teenager and go on dates and be very irresponsible because the oldest child had taken on all the responsibilities. She was doing very well with the responsibilities and leaving very little room for anyone else to do anything. In the beginning, she took the role sort of naturally, and she understood that she was in that role after we had several sessions. And eventually, by the end of our treatment, she really did not want to take that role any longer. And mom had to step in to obviously regulate the family, but there was, this asymmetry really heavy, and the other siblings also knew of the asymmetry, had accepted it, and really didn't know how to balance it and what to do for the sister that had taken that huge responsibility. And there was always a feeling of unfairness towards her as the parentified child. So it is very negative at times.
I feel like, okay, so I looked through the glossary just to like scan.
Sure.
And I think Erlin's definition of parentification is true, but not for this theory, because I'm reading the example, it's on page 35, and it says, a mother who told her 15-year-old daughter, you can go out and do anything as long as you tell me about it, offers freedom to ignore conventional moral constraints in exchange for total sharing. The daughter thus remains a child vis-a-vis. So I don't necessarily think it's in terms of the once again, the behavior that they're doing, but because this is a dialectical theory of the meaning of how you treat someone. So parentification in this case would be the double bind of like, you are this and this. While I think in Erlin's example, where it's like, okay, so the child is helping out the parent, that may not be a negative thing at all because it's not giving them a dual message, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's congruence in the
Yeah,
message.
there's congruence within what is going on. While as if it's like, oh, you can do something, but you have to tell me about it.
Yeah.
You're putting a condition onto the relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, where are we? Here we are. All right, so some theoretical assumptions of contextual is that so as we step into this role, we are assuming that between people, there is a relational reality that is both individually and co-constructed. And so there's an interlocking of their respective spontaneous motivations, which again is at the core of this. It's not just behavioral, it is what is informing the behavior. What are the motivations? What are the ethics behind that? And that another thing, so again, this is where that empathy and the non-pathologizing comes into this, that multi-directional partiality, that people are doing the best that they can in the situation that they're in, using the tools that they learned from their family of origin. So again, heavy emphasis on the transgenerational nature of this approach. So a change occurs when the family members can earn constructive entitlement. There is a balance of receiving and giving, and that breeds trust. And then that is essentially the ultimate goal is to have trusting trusting, balanced relationships. But at the same time, there isn't so much an emphasis on just change and things being different. There's the emphasis on responsibility for the consequences of decisions, behaviors of the self, and the consideration of others and others' consideration of you. That is more, so this responsibility for the consequences is more of a goal than just change. So some interventions. We've talked a lot about it. So multidirectional partiality has quite a few components in it. So this is considered really one of the only interventions, one of the only like techniques within contextual. So this is the stance that's based in very deeply rooted in fairness. So again, giving a platform and empathy in equal doses to each family member. So empathy is the first component of multidirectional partiality. So multidirectional partiality is different from neutrality. You know, we talk a lot about multidirectional impartiality of just, you know, kind of allowing clients to share, but Naji was very purposeful in moving toward the family members and aligning with the family members so that each perspective was elevated. So with this, it's the therapist being open to imagining the feeling of each family member as the family member describes their own personal perspectives and their conflicted interests. Yes, Justine.
Yeah, I also think it's important to note, because he did make clear that one thing he did critique about previous family therapies was this idea of aligning with a certain family member to unbalance or rebalance. So it's important to know that he did not believe in this, because the way he saw it was basically having that fairness and justice of each member, and to not do that as a way to reach rejunction or exoneration.
Yeah, so the role of the therapist wasn't for creating any imbalance or like shaking the system. It was more so for giving a platform and equal distribution of empathy for everyone, but also recognizing that the therapist's ability to do that, to like direct conversation and stuff like that. Is that what you're saying, Justine?
Yeah, so like not so much, because I think he critiqued that in terms of like, oh, that's just a strategy, that's almost a gimmick. And
Sure.
So the way I saw it, and this might be a weird metaphor, but I almost saw the self-therapist as kind of being Switzerland, where it's impartial, but also it's considered very fair and just in all these ways, but not siding with anyone, but still having an effect. But yeah, sorry, that was just my weird metaphor that I thought of when I was.
Yeah, no, thank you. So another piece of this is like I want to highlight the last part of this is that no one is a meritless monster. So again, that ledger of merits. So at the very least, the therapist has to find room in themselves to imagine how the person who may be creating distress or hurt amongst family members has also hurt. So it's just a way of meeting a person in their humanity that allows for some of that maybe like frustration or resentment. It serves as a buffer with that, against that, I guess. So another piece of the multidirectional partiality is crediting. So it is I liked the idea of the tribunal, like I just thought of like Survivor in this, where it lets each person call each other to account for their balance of credits and debits in the ledger of merits. It's also where it also allows family members to establish criteria for fairness moving forward. So this is, again, if these aren't, like, again, these invisible loyalties, if they're not made visible, if they're not explicit, then that messaging is going to continue. So it's an opportunity to negotiate, have conversations around this. So the therapist can use the fairness in their own relational context as a measure and guide for this. And yeah, sorry, I want to make sure that we have some time for the case study as well. Another component of multi-directional partiality is acknowledging. So this is where the therapist is going to model for the family, and then the hope is that the family starts incorporating this into, you know, their interactions with one another, but emphasizing the attempts and contributions that they have made in the relationship. So making those very explicit, and again, having that like positive regard, giving that positive reframe to what is happening within the system. Then one of the biggest concepts with this is accountability and trust. So this is that relational integrity. That's the foundation of trustworthiness and individual health. So you can see both that interpersonal and intrapersonal aspects of accountability. So it follows an accountable therapeutic contract that will retain a profound regard for the consequences of its interventions on everyone who is potentially affected by them. So there's also accountability within the therapeutic relationship that's inherent in that. So the consequences of physical medicine and consequences of psychotherapeutic intervention, whatever its modality, never affect just one person's world. So realizing your own accountability and having consideration for others. So it is this recognition that the decisions, behaviors, all of that stuff that the person makes has a inevitable effect on those around them. So just making the individuals more aware of how their actions and behaviors and all of that kind of stuff affect the people within their systems that they're a part of. So to the concept of rejunction, and we'll talk about exoneration in the next slide. So rejunction is the re-engagement of family members through reinstating a fair balance of giving and receiving within the relationship, and it's meant to renew the capacity of reciprocal acknowledgement, restore fairness and responsibility toward more vulnerable family members and other close relationships. Justine, do you want to add anything about rejunction?
No, not really. I think in terms of rejunction, like you said, totally. I also think one thing that can be added is like, there's no one way of experiencing rejunction, like because the terms and the justices and values are determined by the family, the way that rejunction happens will also be dictated by the family. So there's not one way of like, oh, like you did this to him, so you have to apologize. So it is all dependent on the narrative of the family.
Absolutely. So in order to achieve rejunction, our role as the therapist is to help explore the family's ability to recreate a balance among family members. So we're, we're guiding that conversation. The therapist is looking at how each member is available for one another. So again, our invisible loyalty is there. Is destructive entitlement there? How aware and how open are family members to having different types of dynamics and relationships with one another? Look at how they use each other for their own needs. So again, that entitlement or that potential, parentification. So with rejunction, you're discovering your own and family members' part in the imbalance of the system. So again, that personal accountability, also recognizing how that affects the system and vice versa. And so with this, by understanding your own part in this and other people's part, the hope is to gain a sense of inner entitlement and autonomy and growth. So
And
then,
also,
go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
I can't help but notice like the influences that he talks about of different theories. And I also kind of related to this in terms of like Bowen's definition of differentiation, because of the fact that you're owning how you contribute to anxiety within Bowen's theory, but how you contribute to the injustices and destructive entitlement within this theory as well.
Definitely. Thank you. So exoneration, it is our role in that is helping clients see the intergenerational influence on family members. So the positive intent. So it's again, putting people in context of a way of kind of like liberating some of the people from the family members from resentments, assumption of malintentions, and really understanding kind of how each family member got to where they are in their relational patterns, in their motivations with one another. So it's really understanding how previous generations have influenced the individual, and in a hope of understanding some of the, the impact of invisible loyalties, of legacy, of these things that are passed from generations, and obligation and entitlements, how a destructive entitlement was some of the origins of that, and how it manifests in the family now. So it's more of an insight driven concept within contextual, and then you have the decision as a family to move differently with one another given the insight. So the goal is to diminish the family dysfunction and establish a more loving and trustworthy relationship among all family members, given that there hopefully now is some understanding of what has contributed, what has happened for family members to act and function in the way that they do within the system. Okay. I want to be mindful of time here. Let's go ahead and take one more break. And I want to spend like no more than 10 minutes going through this, but I want to make sure that everyone feels like we're covering what you want to cover. I just really want to give you more of a hands-on application of this with the case study. So let's go ahead and take a break. We'll come back together at 4:10, and then we'll figure out what we want to do moving forward. Go ahead and here. Where is it? Okay. So here's what I've been thinking over the break is I feel like I very consistently don't give y'all a chance to apply what we're learning. So yes, there are some slides that are left, but I think that we can, I want to give you more of like an experiential approach to this, meaning that we can, so the slides that are left are talking about recognizing destructive entitlement, seeing some of the characteristics, as well as going over the phases of therapy that really has just questions that you could ask from a contextual family therapy approach. So I think we can cover those as we integrate it into the discussion about the case study. Does anybody oppose that? I just really want to give you guys a chance to do the case study. Okay, so I'm gonna, I think I emailed this to you, or I posted it in Canvas or something like that, but I do want to share this with you so that if you have any questions about it, because this is a case that I am familiar with, that I can fill in some information that might be helpful for you in conceptualizing this from a contextual approach. So there are 5 people that you are seeing in therapy: Steve and Marcia, who are dating, Stacy, who is Steve's oldest daughter, Laura, who is Steve's youngest daughter, the only 2 daughters of Steve, and Danielle, who is Marcia's oldest daughter, oldest of 3. She has 2 younger brothers who are not in attendance. So Steve and Marcia have been dating for roughly 7 years. They lived together in the home that Steve had shared with his late wife, Catherine. Steve and Marcia are both a widower and a widow. Steve's late wife died nearly 8 years ago. Marcia's late husband died about 11 years ago. Steve's late wife died from cancer after a 5-year battle. Marcia's husband died suddenly of a heart attack. So Steve, Marcia, Danielle, Lee, Brandon, and Laura all live in the same state. Stacy lives across the country, but is attending sessions virtually. The families had consistent issues with being willing to blend and accept one another. Danielle and Laura both believe that their children, so sorry, I'm skipping a little bit. Laura has a 9-year-old daughter. Danielle has 4 children ranging in age from 13, or I think maybe 7 to probably 14. I think that's here. Okay, 6 to 14. So Danielle and Laura both believe that their, where am I? Their children are not getting to spend enough time with their respective grandparents. It's thought that Steve's daughter, Laura, is having trouble accepting and grieving the loss of their mother. Stacy and Laura do not believe that Marcia brings anything to their dad's life. They experience Marcia as boring and passive, very different than their mother. They in no way see Marcia as a replacement or even wanting to take their mom's place. At the same time, they have trouble connecting with her and experience her as cold. Stacy has made attempts to connect with Marcia through conversation, and Laura has not. Marcia feels left out and like an outsider to Steve, Laura, and Stacy. She has never felt accepted by Stacy and Laura. Stacy was initially warmer and more welcoming than Laura, but now both Stacy and Laura are both distant and disinterested in Marcia due to their perception of disinterest and rejection from her. Steve has had a tendency to get in the middle of Marcia and his daughter's issues. Recently, Marcia and Stacy have agreed to not go through Steve to talk about their issues. For a while, that has worked, but it has also resulted in Stacy and Marcia not really communicating at all. Steve feels at a loss as to how to help everyone get along. He tends to just not address issues and has a history of doing this. The clients have come to you to live more cohesively and be more civil and accepting with one another. They are generally quite uncomfortable and anxious in each other's company and would like to not feel so uneasy when they are around each other, which is mostly just holidays. So does anybody have questions for information that they think would be helpful for them? So really what I'm going to ask y'all to do in your breakout rooms is, assess this family from a contextual perspective and create, like, let's say, the makings of a treatment plan of how you would move forward with, like, what do you think is contributing to the issues from a conceptual perspective or from the conceptual approach, and how would you work with this family integrating contextual into that? So information that might be helpful for you. If you don't need anything additional, that's fine. I can put y'all in your breakout rooms. Does anybody have any questions of what is expected of you?
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you elaborate more on the background of Steve and Marcia's family of origin?
Sure. So Steve is the third child he has 3 brothers. Mom and dad were both present. Mom was a homemaker. Dad he owned a business, and mom died at age 60, I believe, and of like heart issues, I think like clogged arteries. And dad died of liver cancer roughly, how many years later? 8 years later. So mom died in 92, dad died in 2000. Do you want further information?
No, just a little on Marcia's too.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
No.
Marcia is the oldest of 3 siblings, a younger brother and sister, close with her sister. In terms of parents, I want to say dad may have died at a young age, maybe when Marcia was in like her teens or 20s. Mom is currently still alive. Marcia spends quite a bit of time with mom because they live in the same town. I don't know as much about Marcia. Sorry.
Did you happen to mention culture of origin?
I did not. So Steve's family is Norwegian and Irish, and Marcia's family is Polish. Steve's family immigrated to the United States during the potato famine. I don't really know exactly when that was, and I don't know when Marsha's family came to the US, but they're multiple generations in the US. Any other questions? All right, so I will put y'all into breakout rooms if I can find it. Why does this always happen to me? There they are. All right. So I'm going to have about, 3 to 4 of you in each room, and we'll come back together, let's say so it's 4:20, like 4:40 to be able to talk in a large group for about 20 minutes. All right, see y'all in a little bit. I hope you had vibrant and fruitful conversations in your breakout rooms. Great, good. Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about conceptualizing this case through a contextual lens. So what concepts do you see at play here? What did y'all talk about? Not quite getting yet to what you'll do with the family, but how you conceptualize them.
One of the things we kept going back to that like I think impacted the way we were trying to conceptualize them was like, why now? We were kind of like it's been 7 years they've been together, they've been living together for 4 years, like, you know, both of the maternal and paternal parent had passed like 11 and 8 years. Like, why was it now? That's kind of what impacted us to be able to conceptualize it further. I don't know if anybody else kind of, other than just wanting more time.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Laura, go ahead, Laura.
The thought was what happened when they all met with each other. That was like, in order to have a better conceptualization of the case, it was like, yes, what happened? Because first impressions are very important sometimes.
So you guys did have more questions for me that I could have answered. Yeah, Justine.
Yeah, I think one thing that we discussed that it was difficult to assess this family is when looking at the 4 domains of contextual, like the facts, the individual psychology, transactional patterns, and relational ethics. From our standpoint, we only got the facts. And it would be hard even to ask you what they were, because I feel like within this theory, we would have to really observe the relational ethics to understand what that would be. So we would really, from what we conceptualize, we only conceptualize it based on facts, which is only part of the theory.
Your math was accurate, Ploy. Yeah, Denise.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of say similar to Justine. I think that we were just sitting there and trying to like be like, we need more information. Like, I don't know where to go with this and what else is necessary. But I think one of the things that we talked about is just kind of seeing where like the other 2 brothers' roles come in as well, and that they're missing, and how that could also be affecting the family as a whole. And so that's something else that we talked about, but also, sorry, I'm like blanking out here.
That's okay.
I don't remember, but if it comes back to me, I'll come back.
Sure. Marcy.
My mouse got away from me. Yeah, so we were just speculating on a lot of this, but we came down in a couple of areas in terms of loyalties and how those loyalties might be split, particularly with the daughters in terms of their father and their late mother, and how that would have an impact on their relationship with their stepmom, as well as who was holding most of the credits and the debits in the ledger. And we decided it was Dad. And that, you know, in order to rebalance the system, we kind of jumped ahead probably about 1 million steps, that, you know, bringing him into a more active role would be a way of getting to that point.
Okay. Thanks, Marcy. Justine.
We also had a question for you, Dr. Lappin, because when we had asked you about like the history of Marcia and Steve, you didn't know that much about Marcia's history. So we were wondering about your multi-directed partiality in terms of.
I love it. Oh, what just happened? Something just talked to me. Actually, I was going to share with the class that this is my family. That's my dad. So that's why I don't know much about Marcia. So my multi-directed partiality is garbage. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Of course.
I think we were all just kind of taking a second real quick.
Yeah, sorry.
We're all going to change the way we speak about this family right
No,
now.
it's okay. It's okay. My family is a bit of a shit show right now. So I know so take whatever time you need, but you are welcome to talk about this in whatever way made sense during your because we can do some self-therapist stuff in it too. So yeah, I'm near and dear to this case.
We didn't know like where it would land. And I know that we talked earlier kind of about like double binds and stuff like that and like how it impacted, but it felt like there was a double bind on Marcia, who I would call Marcy because that's how I wrote her name.
You're fine.
Almost because to the point of her being like kind of passive. I wonder if because they expected their mom to be more passive, they didn't see Marcy as a threat necessarily. But I think that if Marcy was more assertive, they would also be unhappy with it. So I feel like she's kind of in this place where she kind of can't win.
I agree. So also in terms of the double bind, one of the things that I would conceptualize Marcia as, I'm Stacy. So if anybody needed my sister's name is Laura, but it's spelled differently. So anyway, the double bind in terms of communication with Marcia is she will share a desire to my dad to communicate with us and then feels cold. So it's kind of like, the example of the kid that was at the hospital, the mom that was at the hospital, and the kid runs up and is like, Mom, and the kid's like, mommy, I missed you so much. And the mom like stiffens up and is like, missed you too. That to me is a metaphor for the interactions with her. But I'm going to try to I promise I'm trying to be as objective as possible because I really do have empathy for all the players in this. Yes, and I do agree, Caitlin. Marcia's in a little bit of a no-win situation. Justine.
So we can't comment or conceptualize this. We don't know all the elements since I said we only knew the facts, but we came up with a hypothesis that may or may not be true, but just from talking about legacies and entitlements, we found it interesting that Steve would pick a woman who is somewhat going through a parallel process, as she is also a widow while he is a widower. And we were wondering if the legacy of trying to recreate that relationship with their past mother is contributing to this coldness towards Marcia because of her inability to connect due to her own sorrows. So symbolically, almost speaking, that they're trying to create rejunction through this relationship with Marcia, but because, like they had mentioned in the chat, that Steve hasn't grieved his first wife yet, that maybe through the relationship with Marcia, he's trying to relive that or find closure within that. But because he's not taking that relationship as a relationship within itself, it's a continuation of his grief to that relationship.
Yeah, I like that interpretation. Thank you, Justine. Denise. I saw 2 hands, I think, on your screen.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to applaud. I was like, this is really like just insensitive me right now. No, but I don't know if we were talking about techniques yet. So
yeah, so we can move toward, because it sounds like you are given maybe not sufficient information to really like conceptualize, but yeah, let's move toward like, what would you do with this family?
So some of the things that our group at least talked about was just like where the loyalty lands, invisible loyalty and split loyalty, between like children and parents, but also between like dad and the daughters and then the other family. And then the empathy, it was like what we talked about a lot in our group was just having empathy for each and every family member that there has been a loss in their life, and being able to like acknowledge that, and that accountability piece comes in. The piece that we were, I think, confused on was rejunction. And so I was talking about it maybe being able to identify roles in the family. Like, for example, like Steve's role is to be dad to Stacy and Laura, and then is partner of Marcia. But then like, what is his role to the other children and vice versa? Like so being able to have that conversation among the family to be able to create that balance that's needed. So that's something that we talked about again with what we had.
Great. Thank you, Denise. Juliana.
So we spoke about loyalty as well in our group, and in order to really explore loyalty and fairness, we would have to actually see what the narrative was before that, and really probably bring some more generations in the picture so that the kids can see where dad's point of view is. However, there's something that's going on with the kids, which is probably their loyalty lens with the person that they're missing the most, because that person is not present, but there's also a second betrayal that's happening. Not only did the person leave this world, but there's now another one that's taken that role per se for dad, but for everyone else, that person cannot take that role at all. So it would be very, very delicately delegated to establish fairness once again, especially to the ones that are being a bit more emotionally not available to what is going on, because Stacy's trying. She's trying to
she is.
Right. And so in order for Stacy's efforts to also be acknowledged, there has to be fairness that belongs to Stacy. And everyone else that's kind of taken a step back needs to also acknowledge that, so there's more fairness established.
Yeah, thank you, Juliana. Courtney.
Well, one, I'm really sorry for your mom.
Thank
I
you.
know it's a long time ago, but that's really hard, and I'm really sorry, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Of course, thank you for holding space for me for it, even though it was a little coerced.
I think we talked a lot about trust in our group, and just kind of this like lack of trust all around, almost
100%.
like a lack of trust for Marcia to fill the space that mom left, a lack of trust that Marcia actually wants to get to know them and be part of your family in a way that mom did. Perhaps a lack of trust that dad fully grieved mom's loss, that, you know, even with anticipatory grief of 5 years of treatment, 1 year is, after loss is like not a long time. And lack of trust for Steve to pick, like, if we go into object relations, right, like a good enough partner.
Sure.
And then like lack of trust that Steve will actually listen and hear all of the sides, right? So maybe Marcia's not really trusting Steve to hold space for her and his daughters at the same time. And then of course, right, the entitlement and like lack of trust that grandkids are gonna get time And then that we also kind of, right as we ran out of time, like get into the revolving slate of like the loss of time or lack of time with mom slash and then grandmom because of premature death and that, right? Then like the grandkids are inherently not going to get that time with mom, but they're also, it sounds like, not getting it with Steve and Marsha as well. So that kind of, I think we spent a lot of time talking about trust in our group.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Courtney. What else? What else did y'all talk about? Well, I do have a question, like process wise for the class. Did it change anything learning that it was my family? Like from initial, I don't know, assessment, conceptualization, emotion?
It loaded more emotion for me.
I think for me, it's just appreciation that you're sharing yourself with us.
Yeah, it is a family that would benefit from therapy. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing with us. And I'm also kind of curious if you don't mind sharing with us in terms of like how you view trust within the system or how you would like trust to exist within the system.
That's a great question. I think Courtney hit a lot of the things that I personally struggle with. So trust in my dad to hold space for us. I will say that the dynamic from my perspective, so again, we have not gone to therapy. We are a historically not very communicative family. I think that's one of the contributing factors to me being in this field of wanting to help facilitate that, potentially some vicarious healing for me. So trust that my dad is able to hold space for us in sharing grievances, in being bereaved, and having the belief that our intentions are valid and positive. So that's another, so thinking of like relational ethics, there's not a whole lot of positive intentions or positive motivation that is assumed of anyone. So I love the question, I think Caitlin or somebody posed like, why now? That it's been an ebb and flow where there's absolutely some historical information that initially the relationship was pretty accepted and then things just continued to like devolve, not really happen, not be communicated about. And it's hit a little bit of a, what's it called? Like mass, it's hit a critical point, I think, critical mass, that's what I was looking for. But also, trust that my sister will be able to appropriate or like healthfully grieve. She has not grieved at all. I've been to therapy for it. My dad has not. I don't think that he's attended to his grief at all. Trust that Marsha will actually be congruent in her communication of a desire to have a relationship with us, but have her actions be consistent with that. Like trust that we can be a unit, like that we can have like a shared space for grieving. So yes, every single person in this story has lost somebody very prematurely. So, and there has been no acknowledgement of that. That's been like with the case study with the sisters, right? Like they lost their parents. They didn't really talk about it a whole lot. It's a very poignant piece. So that to me is how I conceptualize or experience some of it's an absolute lack. It's a lack of trust.
I just wanted to comment on something too, because as I'm looking at it, I think it's also interesting maybe for Laura, who lost mom and had to become a mom really quickly at a really young age. Like I'm looking at the time. And so maybe that's why she's holding on to so much, because I lost somebody, I had my daughter, and now I have to accept somebody else that came at a really weird time.
Absolutely.
So I think just giving space to that too, where that's a sucky feeling.
For sure.
So yeah.
And navigating motherhood without a mother to talk to about it. All right, what do you got, Tiffany? Would it be a stretch to invite all deceased parties into the shared space when everyone is together just to acknowledge the losses? I don't think that would be a stretch. And I also think that that would be within this model and many of the models that we've talked about, that it would be something that would be invited, because these are individuals who are absolutely affect the system and it's functioning today. All right, so thank you, everyone. We were at a little bit of a loss for a case, so I was like, I'll do it. So Marcy did submit one for our for week 14, so we'll be working with, I think, a case, Marcy, that you've been working with for years, or I don't know if you said years. I don't know where that came from, but yeah. So thank you, everybody, for engaging in this. Please don't worry about any offense or anything like that, any impressions or anything like that. Hopefully normalizing that families are shit shows. And we get what we get, I guess. So thank you so much. And we will have Jackie, Seda, Denise, and Justine next week doing some complimentary stuff to what we learned this week. So I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see all of you next Tuesday.
Thank you so much.
So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.